the many feel supported, they also in turn afford their support to the system. And to some extent, I will argue what has been happening in the last few decades is the community has been has become more shrunken, and its powers have been decimated. And in that process, while the markets and the government have expanded, the community has been unable to perform its basic functions. And that, to my mind, is an important source of the dysfunctionality in society today. So let me start making this point clearer by talking first about markets. And in any theory of change, you have to ask what is the outside force that is changing, or is this change internal or endogenous? And I would argue that Marx had it right when he said technology and technological change is the biggest source of change in society. And it's no exception this time around also that technological change has had enormous impacts on markets, on governments, and on the community. And that's what I'm going to talk about in the next 3 slides. Think about the information and communication technology revolution. It certainly has changed markets in 2 or 3 important ways. First, it has made trade much more feasible. Think, for example, of global container ships, one of which got stuck in the Suez Canal. But these have knitted countries together, knitted production centers together, because all you need to do is put your stuff in that container ship, lock it, and send it. And the standardization of the container, et cetera, and the low cost of sending it means that it reaches the other side at relatively low cost. There are many other ways that trade has been facilitated by low transportation costs, but certainly containers are a big sort of part of that change. Moreover, it's not just the ability to send goods, big, heavy things at low cost. It's also the ability to send bytes across borders at relatively low cost. Communication has become much easier, and that has helped transform the nature of production. Earlier, you didn't want to produce in Thailand, for example, for the US market, because you had no idea what supply disruptions would happen. You couldn't monitor your factory there in real time. And so unless there were heavy raw materials which needed you to situate production there, you really were reluctant to do it. Today, because you can control what happens in a factory in real time, it's much easier to situate production there because you can react in real time to potential disruptions and find alternatives. At best, what you do is create another production facility in some other developing country or emerging market, and you really are looking for the best place to manufacture. Now, this has been beneficial for many emerging markets, but the flip side of it is it has hit manufacturing in industrial countries. Industrial countries had centers such as, in Chicago, Gary, Indiana, to the south of it was a steel production center. But of course, as steel gets produced cheaper elsewhere, those production facilities start shutting down. And you can see this across the industrial West, that the old manufacturing towns have shut down, and workers there have lost their jobs. In the U.S., economists famously have looked at this, calling it the China shock, to look at as China entered global supply chains, what happens in a variety of places in the U.S. And you can see a lot of devastation in firms closing. There is a counterpart to this, of course, which is that even while industrial countries have been losing traditional manufacturing jobs, they certainly have been creating jobs in high-tech manufacturing, but also a significant number of jobs in services. The problem, however, the jobs that are created are usually created elsewhere, in the big cities, in the and created for highly educated people and not for the moderately educated person who used to hold that middle class unionized job at GM or Ford. And so as a result, what you've seen is a hollowing out to some extent of the middle class in terms of jobs. Jobs have disappeared in the middle. They have been created at the high end, but they also have been created at the low end. The jobs in Amazon warehouses, for example, in putting together packages and so on. Um, as much as globalization has created a hollowing out of middle income jobs, perhaps much more has been automation, has been digitization in some sense. And it's happened also in services. If you think of the accountant who used to have a good job because she knew every last detail of the tax code, now that accountant is being replaced by a software program, TurboTax. And instead of having somebody who really knows the tax code, what you have is a high school graduate who knows how to operate TurboTax, who works for H&R Block and helps out in people doing their taxes. So effectively, automation also contributes to the hollowing out by removing those middle income jobs and creating jobs at the lower end and the upper end. So what the ICT revolution has done is change the nature of jobs and created a more integrated global market, both of which have largely affected the moderately educated sort of worker in industrial countries. And that has been a big facet of some of the tension, political tension in these countries, whether it's Germany, whether it's the UK or the United States over the last so many years. Very few countries, for example, the Scandinavian ones, have dealt with this in a more effective way. Now, typically, as markets have grown and become more integrated, you might think government would have shrunk. But instead, what has happened is governance powers have, in some cases, expanded and often migrated up from the local to the national to the global. Give you one example. When banks were located at the local level, when they used to cater to small towns, basically regulation of those banks was local. Now, as banks became more national, regulation migrated up from the states to the national level, and you had national bodies, the Federal Reserve, the controller of currency, regulating these banks. Now, in recent years, as banks have become more international, many of the rules and regulations to govern banks are set at the international level in places like Basel. So effectively, what we have is a migration upwards in governance. And it has become more encompassing, much less local, much more national and international. There is another element to this. For example, take social insurance, right? Helping out people who fall on hard times. Now, this has, ever since the 17th, 18th century, become an important facet of society. But it used to be done at the very local level. In Adam Smith's time, if there was any help, it was at the parish level that it was given. But as economies have become more integrated, little parishes became overwhelmed by nationwide recessions. And social security, social insurance migrated up to the state level and then the national level. So today, for example, in the United States, if you look at the top-ups to unemployment insurance, in an attempt to deal with the prolonged nature of the pandemic, they're all coming from the federal government, not from the state government, which is typically where unemployment insurance is located. They're coming from the federal government. And that's an example of the government stepping up. I call it the state, but don't confuse it with state government. It's national or federal government stepping up in times of pandemic or in times of national calamity or national downturns. And as we've had more of those over the 20th and the 21st century, more and more powers have migrated to the national government. The power to raise taxes, the power to spend, all that has gone up. So markets have expanded, governments have expanded. And not just to the national level, as I said, to the international level. More and more stuff is determined at the international level. For example, in the European Union, many regulations are not determined at the national level, but at the union level. The third facet is of course, the community. I've talked about economic activity leaving communities. And as the jobs leave, typically social disintegration sets in. Marriages break down, you have more divorces, you have, with broken families, more possibilities of substance abuse, and substance abuse often invites crime. This also weakens local institutions like schools. So this is the ironic fact that as technological change has increased the importance of a good education, of good schooling, local schools, especially in areas that are falling behind, have deteriorated in quality. And this becomes a double whammy because not only are they bad and therefore people in those neighborhoods can't sort of ramp up their capabilities to get the new jobs that are emerging, but also people in those neighborhoods seeing the breakdown of the schools basically say, do I want my kids to go to school? No, because my kids will be forever handicapped. So you have a cessation of the successful also, basically a community that starts disintegrating. The disintegration is accelerated by good people leaving. And as a result, what happens is you have a substantial deterioration in community life. And as a result of community institutions. So why am I saying the community has weakened? It clearly, aside from all the other structural forces that are hitting on the community, we can talk about those later, but it has been differentially hit by the economic forces. It has been steadily disempowered. And as a result, it is unable to cope to give its members access to a sound education, to good healthcare, etc., and it is disintegrating. And one of the tensions you see in the political dialogue in the US, for example, is what you think about the intentions of people in Washington depends tremendously on where you come from, the importance of place. And typically people on the coast that have benefited tremendously in the urban areas tend to have a much more favorable opinion than people in the middle of the country, especially those in rural areas or in semi-urban areas. And that is influenced in many ways by what they see on the ground. Now, if you look at the pandemic has accelerated every fault line. We have the capable, the well-educated people who are on this call being able to work from home and do high value-added services, while people on the front line basically earning low incomes are exposed to the virus. Of course, it's much worse in emerging markets and developing countries where the same divides exist, but the social protections and the incomes are much lower. Now, in many of these situations, civil society, local community has been critical in filling in holes. Many young are in the early days of the pandemic, before supply lines got established, used to do the shopping for the elderly and the disabled. There's been a lot of focus on how to help migrants who are cut off from social services, or at least official social services. There is a fair amount of communities doing the policing of social distancing. For example, one of the reasons why some of the Asian societies have been more effective at limiting the spread of the virus is communities have gotten together to police, sometimes in a brutal fashion that we would be unhappy with, but often in a reasonable way to police members of the community and tell them, for the public good, you have to stay at home and not go out. For the public good, if you are supposed to be in quarantine, don't come out. And many have also come together to create safety nets. So there has been a flourishing of community activities. Of course, there's also been some centralized brutal solutions, nationwide abrupt lockdowns, which have hurt communities. And of course, the flip side, sometimes nationwide support because local support is ineffective. Now, in this environment, there is an opportunity to think again. What have we missed as the pandemic sort of jolts us and creates some opportunity to build back in a broader, more effective way? What do we need to do? I would argue that in order to get a sound globalization, we should be careful about internationalizing governance too much, about elevating governance above where people feel they can control it, having too many international bodies, having too many decisions determined far away, that tends to breed resentment. So I would instead push powers back down to the national government, and from the national government to local government. If you think about Brexit, for example, one of the motivating factors there were people were saying we've lost control. We want to get back control. But that didn't mean get back control from the European Union to London. It meant further take back control from London to the local areas because we just feel disempowered. So responsible sovereignty means take back power from the international to the national. That's the sovereignty part. But further from the national to the local, which I call inclusive localism. We need more localism, but it has to be more inclusive. Let me emphasize the details of that over the next couple of slides, and then I will end. The details are, there are some metrics for how you bring powers back. And often what is enunciated is the principle of subsidiarity. Push powers back to the lowest level that can handle them effectively, right? So what this means is climate change doesn't get negotiated at the local level. It's too big, it's too all-encompassing an issue. It does mean we consult bottom up in a country to find out what people are willing to agree to, but then we need a global agreement on how to tackle climate change, that for sure. But it can be a fairly light global agreement, which is now then decentralized further into the country. So my first point is avoid too many binding international treaties or attempts at harmonization. They tend to disempower people, and disempowerment tends to be the death of democracy. So, and similarly, don't depend too much on centralized one-size-fits-all solutions. I mean, we've gotten really dependent on monetary policy to fix all our problems. Monetary policy tends to be one-size-fits-all and doesn't really help everywhere. I mean, think of low interest rates. I mean, many of us live in communities where low interest rates have little effect. People don't even have access to the financial system. How are they going to be able to benefit from low interest rates? You really have to work on developing the local in order for it to have a chance. And often it means the first step is to create a better business environment by bringing down crime. That seems the first step rather than lower interest rates, because people in the community have no access to borrowing in the first place. One example of subsidiarity is Switzerland and education. In Switzerland, as you move to higher levels of education, higher levels of government take care of it. Institutes of technology are extremely expensive. And so the federal government looks after it, the federal government finances it. High schools, much less expensive. So the cantons, 26 of them, look after the high schools, monitor them, look after them. And primary schools, 3,000 municipalities, each municipality has its own primary school. So at each level of education, you have some sense as a parent of having some control. The higher the level, the less control you have. But at the local level, you can certainly determine what your little kids learn in primary school by participating in community activity at the municipality level. So number one is push powers back down to the local. Don't have federal bureaucracies take away too many of those powers. Don't have international bureaucracies take them away. The second is to spread economic activity across place. And this is something that might be a silver lining of the pandemic. We know that many jobs can be done at home, far away from the place of work. 45% of jobs in rich countries can be done at home, at least according to one survey. So, what we should do is find ways to spread economic activity. Not everybody needs to stay in a big city in order to work there. You can actually work some distance from the city and go in once a week and maybe once in 2 weeks as we come back from the pandemic. So, one possibility is service jobs may be spread more widely as we come back from the pandemic. Many firms will go back to working from office, but it may be 3 days a week rather than 5 days. Once you have to work 3 days a week and you have a 4 day weekend, well, maybe you might live 100 miles from the city rather than in the city itself because you want your kids to have cleaner air, easier commute, etc. And that could spread economic activity across the country. And this is true as much for developing countries as industrial countries, but industrial countries have a head start here because more jobs can be done at home. The second is you can actually create products for in niche markets in remote areas. But what technology allows you to do is connect up to the global market. One example of this is the Wengards, an Amish family in Ohio, who have a flourishing business selling high-tech horse-drawn farm equipment. And you might argue, where is there a market for high-tech horse-drawn farm equipment? And the obvious answer is Amish people across the country believe in horse-drawn farm equipment. That's what they want to get. And so if you can connect the Amish producer in Ohio with Amish consumers across the country, you have a reasonable business. And that's what they've done. This is a very successful firm. Of course, once in a while, you find people outside the Amish who want high-tech horse-drawn equipment, and they will buy. The broader point is niche markets can be catered to by producers across the United States and in every industrial country. That's a benefit of technology, and that could spread economic activity, create more viable communities across the country. This bottom-up approach, I argue, what I call inclusive localism, can save globalization because it maintains the global nature of production, but at the same time, it does reduce the resentment against globalization because more people can find some benefit from that. Let me end by saying, what about broken communities? Many of us know broken communities, communities that are ridden with crime. And I would argue that in many industrial countries, what this does is create problems of underdevelopment. These are actually underdeveloped segments of an industrial country, may have been developed in the past, but as a result of the social dysfunction, et cetera, that sets in when economic activity leaves, these resemble very poor developing countries. If you walk through some of the places, for example, a few miles from my house in the south side of Chicago, it will not look amiss in a very poor developing country because of the breakdown. And so what you need to do here is community revival, and there are lots of ideas here. We've already talked about community empowerment. I mean, in order for communities to be able to revive themselves, they need some ability to govern their own lives. You need leadership. In Pilsen, a few miles from my house, in the 80s, there were 21 gangs in over 2 miles of the main street in Pilsen. And the level of murder in Pilsen was approaching the death rate on the Eastern Front in World War II per 100,000 people. It was horrendous. But a group came together in the community voluntarily and said, look, we can't let this go on. We have to make a difference. And they started by tackling crime. They came out. They tried to get some of the youth who were in the gangs jobs in regular businesses. They tried to crowd out crime by coming out in the evenings and preventing lonely places where crime spreads. And generally, working across the community, they brought down crime levels. Once they brought down crime levels, business started moving in because business likes a cheap location just next to a big city, city of Chicago, and economic activity started picking up. Now, there are many ways we can replicate this, but each locality has its own unique way, and it requires ownership. It requires leadership, which then brings in community engagement and involvement. But without the community, if the community is relying on the outside to do it, it's not going to happen. But there are many success stories where communities have been engaged, have actually done it. To facilitate leadership, perhaps lower taxes in these communities for people who move in there. Perhaps, in some situations where you have college loans, forgiving of college loans, conditional on your spending time in the community might be useful, but there are many ideas about this. As far as community engagement goes, there's much more of a role for technology here. Technology enables greater engagement. There are apps, for example, which allow you to point to a pothole and then click a picture that goes onto the community website and stays there until local government has fixed it. So many ways for communities to engage with their local government, to monitor their local government, to ensure that it does the right thing. And that means that local government can be much more responsive and much less corrupt, much more transparent than it used to be in the past. So a lot of infrastructure needs also in some of these communities, just changing the nature of maybe access to parks or access to the waterfront can immensely increase the attractiveness of a community. Transportation networks are also very important. Poor people find it particularly hard to get to work. And if public transport takes an enormously long time to get there, it makes it harder for them to get a job or retain it. Here, much more local input is needed to make those transportation networks effective. For example, in Philadelphia, it was found that your public transport took 88% of jobs were more than 1 hour from your place of work. And if you're more than 1 hour going in the morning, more than 1 hour coming back in the evening, there are many situations in which you miss the bus and you get late for work and you get fired. It turns out that 73% of jobs were within 15 minutes of a bus stop. So you could actually speed up that transportation, except the way it was structured was hub and spoke. First, you took a bus to go to the hub, and then from that hub, you went to where the jobs were, which took everybody significant amounts of time. Would make far more sense to connect the places where people worked, which were agglomerations of workers' houses, with where workers lived, with where they worked. And if you did that, you could reduce commute time significantly. So those are things where local solutions, local workers pointing out that if they had a direct bus every once in a while, it would make such a difference. That could help localities. I'm going to the micro here because I'm saying there's so much scope for change if we can do it right. And the wrong way to do it is by big government coming in and saying, here's what we do, or big markets doing it. I think you want to think at the smaller local level. And finally, funding. Many of these situations, funding could help. But funding comes with strings attached with some person in DC or on Delhi determining what happens. What you need is a lot more decentralization of funding. And in the past, this used to be something people resisted by saying, "Oh, those locals are corrupt. They will waste it. They don't know how to spend it." I think increasingly we're seeing that local government can be quite effective, especially because it's in touch with the people it's trying to help. Those people can monitor what goes on, and they can actually enable effective government through their monitoring. Last point, I mean, there's a lot of talk often of gentrification. When you improve a community, the poor people in it get driven out of their houses because the cost of rents go up, etc. Well, one of the things communities can do is, as they set out, they can buy more local assets and hold on to them, because as the community improves, those local assets increase in value. And then they can be the source of spending, which can help some of those people who are being hurt by the process of community revival, hurt in the sense of having to pay higher rents and so on. The community as a whole can benefit from revival. So bottom line, I'm arguing that what we need is a certain amount of localism, walls around communities to give a sense of identity and empowerment, which can be beneficial in its own right as people feel powerless in the face of globalization. So it can be very useful, but it can also be very useful in allowing for more local solutions, which are probably what are needed in these difficult times. But it also can be where the jobs of the future lie as we get more automation. A lot more of the jobs will lie in helping others. For example, helping the elderly deal with the problem of loneliness. Loneliness is a bigger and bigger problem, accentuated by the pandemic. In order to deal with that, we need people. And as we automate more and more, that's an issue where people will still have a role, and communities can play an important role here. Now, I said walls, but those walls should be low, and this is where the state and markets can be effective. We need, for example, in these communities, laws against discrimination. That is going to ensure people can move back and forth across the community wall. It's a low wall, but nobody is kept out. That's a fear that many people have. These communities can become sort of, places of racism, places of discrimination. Well, we can prevent that, but while making them places where different groups can enjoy a different sense of what they think is the way they should live, gives for more freedom when you have more local powers to determine how you live. So you can balance these two, laws against discrimination, while empowering your ability to live the way you want. And that, to my mind, can help us have more flourishing communities. One example of this is in the United States. States can actually enact laws on commerce within the state, but they cannot keep out the goods from another state. That's the Commerce Clause that prevents tariff barriers between states in the United States. That's an example of what I mean at the community level also. You can have community laws on, on this and that, but you do have to live in an integrated country, and you cannot keep out people or keep out goods. Let me stop there and say, therefore, the third pillar is really about trying to find a way that we can manage faceless globalization by strengthening community once again. And I have a fairly broad view of community, but I do think that in many situations it requires strengthening economic activity, and that starts with empowering and empowering the local much more than it has been in the recent past. Let me stop there.
Thank you, Professor Rajan. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts today. It was really interesting to hear the discussion about the idea of the bottoms-up approach to include local solutions to help rebuild, especially after the pandemic. We have about 35 people in attendance today, and I'm going to open it up for Q&A. Guys, the way we're going to do the Q&A is please raise your hand using the raise hand feature. I will call out your names, and you can go ahead and ask Professor Rajan the question. Anushka, please go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much, Professor Rajan, for being here today. My question was regarding localism. So you emphasized moving towards localism, and what I understand is coordination between local communities is essential because you have to establish a consistent integrated infrastructure. How would you bring that coordinating mechanism with localism in place? What would be some possible features?
Well, this is where the issue of subsidiarity comes in, right? What needs extensive coordination would not be left primarily to local forces. What needs very little coordination could be more local. So, for example, take regulations on emissions. it would be crazy to have a car stop at every locality and check whether it meets the emission requirements of that particular locality. And if it doesn't, it has to take a circuitous route around that. That is empowerment gone crazy. On the other hand, it is quite possible you could have different minimum wages, different working hours in a locality. They could determine some of those things. What the size of the locality is, one could argue over, but those are things which you don't have to. It's only when you work in a particular area you got to check. Am I okay with the minimum wages? Am I okay with the working hours and so on? So in that sense, the extent of subsidiarity, depends. I mean, to some extent, on what is easy to do and what is hard to do. So for transportation networks, for example, it probably makes sense to have a regional transportation network and decisions made at the regional level, but it means that you also want to include the local people in each area to understand what their needs are and to fit the network across the local bodies based on need and the most effective way of doing it. So you want to be democratic, you want to hear, but it would not be that every locality determines its own transportation needs and they don't fit together.
Thank you, Professor. That explains a lot of questions I
had. Next, we have, I hope I don't butcher the name, Yael Hungerford.
Thank you. Yes, I'm with the Adam Smith Society. Thank you so much for that really interesting talk, Professor Rajan. I really enjoyed that. I was hoping to clarify something you said. So you suggested that the flexible work arrangements have the potential to reinvigorate local communities because people don't have to live in the center of very expensive cities. I was hoping you can clarify, do you think businesses ought to allow flexible work arrangements because of the potential social good? Or will there just be a potentially nice coincidence in this case?
Well, I think there's both a demand and a supply, right? You are seeing sort of workers say, we want, some workers, not all. I mean, people with very young kids would rather be out of the home rather than at home with the kids messing up their work. But especially when the kids, there's no childcare facilities at this point or schools. But I think you will find that some people want to spend more time at home, but studies show, on average, people want to spend about 2 days at home and 3 days in the office. When you look from the company side, companies, see some merit in having more productive workers. If they don't do the long commute, maybe they can work harder at home. And, there is this phenomenon where people actually sometimes working harder at home in some jobs than they would work in the office. But there's also the worry that companies have that you lose a sense of culture, sense of being knit together. So on average, companies want 4 days a week and 1 day you spend at home. And I'm sure different companies will come to a happy mix of what is needed. From the corporate side, I mean, it saves on space. You can if 80% of your workers come in, you need 80% of the building space, for example, and so on. So there are some savings on both sides. I think that it's going to be hard to legislate this and say you must do so many hours a week, because every company will have a different place it wants to be depending on its work. And so my guess is we'll see some happen, and this is an ongoing process. It's just that technology has sped up this possibility by saying, well, you don't need to be at the office to get much of the benefits of the office.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Eddie, you're up next.
First of all, thank you for coming and speaking to us. It was very, very interesting. You touched a little bit on less industrialized areas or cities. So I originally come from El Salvador, a very small country in Latin America with horrible economic results in the last few years and a lot of violence and corruptions, which are things you touched on. So I want to understand a little, how do you think you revitalize and create this or desire to create economic activity in these countries that are, because I've seen people who come in and try to revitalize this, but the corruption is just so bad that, you know, it doesn't end up working out. So how do you approach that?
It's harder. I mean, I keep saying that the problems in industrial countries with underdevelopment are easier to deal with in one sense, because what you have is an outside functioning system. It's just locally it's broken down. And so if you can tie back to the functioning system, you can get 90% of the way, right? So, you know, Pilsen in the city of Chicago, Chicago is a vibrant city, has much need for warehouses, for various factory workers and so on. So Pilsen could very well piggyback onto Chicago by, you know, fixing the problems locally. And then, you know, much of it sort of follows. You don't have a problem of reinventing the court system. You don't have to reinvent the laws because they're pretty good outside. And you just have to make sure that your system sort of works and latches on to that. For a developing country or an emerging market, it's more difficult because in some cases, nothing works that effectively. Pretty much everything has broken down from the top. And it's really a question of fixing every aspect. And this is more difficult. I mean, the mantra in development used to be fix the institutions. But, you know, institutions can't just be transported into a country. You don't suddenly transport rule of law into a country and imagine that next day it will be perfectly functioning. You don't transport a constitution to a country. There's sometimes a misstatement, sometimes a misinterpretation of the work of people like Daron Acemoglu and Robinson that, you know, just get the institutions right. Well, you know, institutions don't happen magically. If you impose the Constitution of the United States on Liberia, you don't get the United States, you get Liberia. And that's exactly what happened. So what you need to do, I mean, to some extent, I'm of the view that institutions are endogenous. They accompany the politics. What you really need to do is get the politics right within a country, which is a politics which is much less sort of one versus the other and much more common goal oriented. You know, how does that happen? It happens in ways we don't fully understand. It happens. It's not completely ruled out of the question. And there are, we can see situations where it's much harder to get the politics right. But it does happen. You know, so I would say, I think you can do a lot locally, but it helps to have a national structure which is functioning to latch on to. Otherwise, your local has to flourish independent of the national structure, which is much harder. Now, if you want to ask the broader question, how do we develop? Well, that's the question of the ages, right? And if we had a very easy answer to that, we wouldn't have any poor countries in the world.
Definitely. Thank you so much. Yeah, that definitely answered.
Hey, Shivam, you're up next for the next question.
Thank you, Dr. Rajan. Thank you for this interesting talk. So you were talking about how movement from cities will take place to outside cities into local regions. I was thinking about cities also have this is an interesting place where interaction between social classes takes place, and there are a large number of niche in-person businesses like specialized restaurants, like specialized entertainment options and stuff like that. how do you think this aspect of these like cities will interact with this movement outside city? Like, will it speed load speed down, or will these businesses like stop showing up, or like they stop coming up?
No, look, there is a movement towards cities because of all the goodies that they have. And there's no doubt that as cities recover from the pandemic, much of that will reestablish itself. I don't think New York City will be starved of people, even though it may seem right now that people are avoiding the cities. They will come back. There's too much vibrancy. There's what economists call agglomeration economies. You meet people serendipitously that you're in the same business with. You exchange ideas. New businesses start. There's a lot of that goes on in cities. So I think the issue is not so much the cities will die out, but that the pace at which they were growing relative to the rest of the country may slow down somewhat. And that gives the rest of the country a chance, in a sense, to establish themselves. And what I'm saying is the best way to establish themselves outside is with a modicum of people who are, well-trained, capable, etc., and together to create a sort of microcosm which is has the institutional strengths, the community colleges, the schools, etc., to afford people in that area a reasonable chance at the modern economy. So I'm talking about healthier communities and not having the cities suck away all the life breath in these communities. But I have no doubt that cities will assume their attraction once again, and the best and the smartest will keep looking towards the cities as a place to migrate to.
Thank you.
Gaurav, you can go ahead.
Yeah. Thanks to Mr. Rajan. This was a great talk. So my question revolves around your idea of strengthening the local economies. Like for our colleges based out of St. Louis, and St. Louis City has a tax of 1% on all the residents who earn within the area of the city. But recently, because of the work from home norms, they have faced a lot of backlash, and there have been court filings and petitions against eradicating these taxes. So do you think as this work from home norms will increase the cities which are levying these taxes just to support their economic development, this will face more backlash from the people who move in for their work from home activities? Or do you think that cities will expand their tax base and levy more taxes, or more cities will follow in these?
I mean, I think as mobility of jobs increase, cities will have to do more to justify the taxes they're levying, right? This has always been the case. I mean, cities have benefited from people coming in because everybody else is there. They've benefited from these network effects from agglomeration economies. And now that you can get some of that by staying more remotely, cities will have to rethink some of their taxation and say, well, maybe I should account for the possibility that, if I tax them too much, they may find it fairly convenient to live elsewhere and stay away. So any such technology-induced movement of jobs and of communication will put pressure on cities and force them to rethink some of their tax base and tax policies.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. That answers a lot.
Professor Rajan, we're going to take just a couple of more questions and then we'll wrap up the event. Ira, you're up next.
Firstly, thank you, Dr. Rajan. That was a great talk. I really enjoyed it. I'm from India, and my question is also about the total permissible borrowings by companies in India. And if you have any thoughts about whether that should be in direct proportion to or in the multiples of the paid up equity plus reserves that will increase and decrease with profit and loss as compared to what currently is the norm.
I don't know what the norm is. But any company will borrow to the extent that borrowing is cheaper for a variety of reasons. And those of you who've read Modigliani Miller know that this is not an open and shut case, but they will try and borrow if they think it's cheaper. And they will also recognize there are some costs associated with borrowing, which is you get into trouble when your revenues fall significantly, as for example, during the pandemic. So you want to keep some buffers. And that's been the age-old way that companies think about it. And they will continue to do that no matter what the norms are.
Thank you.
We'll take the last question from Will.
Professor, thank you. I'm also in St. Louis, and the way St. Louis is set up, there's the city and county, which are separate entities. And within the city, it's run by a group of aldermen and a mayor, which causes a lot of problems with setting policies for the greater good, as well as issues between the county and city. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on how there's been a lot of talks about combining the cities and merging the city and county, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on how the two can reconcile sometimes harmful competition between the city and county.
Yeah, I mean, what you're basically talking about is different levels of government sometimes, start fighting each other. And you can see it most visibly in New York City versus New York State. And there are fights at the county level, there's fights at the much more local level. I mean, that's inevitable. I mean, when there are personalities and there's power, there's always a fight about who gets what. And I think that, this is a place where you, in a sense, have to work it out for the greater good. And while that's very nice to say, in practice, it means, somebody fights until they get beaten into shape. And that leads to nasty battles and so on. So I don't have an easy answer to this. It goes with the territory of power and personalities. I think over time, governments figure out a modus vivendi. You take care of this, I take care of that. And our funding is appropriately structured so that you have the means to take care of that. I have the means to take care of this. What becomes more problematic is when there are new demands on the funding. And then there's a question of who's going to take care of that problem. And that's when you start having new fights. Why should I be responsible for this when I have no money? Well, you can manage within your budget, which means you give up on this or that. That gets into a whole new fight. But there's another way of saying that, this comes with the territory of having multiple governments look at have the same sort of territory that they're governing, but at different levels. And so when I said the principle of subsidiarity, it was all very well as a principle, but when you take it to the ground, you have real people, and real people often fight about who's supposed to do what and what powers they have. And so that has to be managed also. In India, for example, the state governments resent the power of the center and wanted much more power. And typically, there's a finance commission which is supposed to allocate funds between the state government and the national government. The Finance Commission has allocated a lot of funds to state government. But the Finance Commission has further said you should further allocate those funds to the local government. State governments have been very happy to take the money the central government gives them, but have been very reluctant to give it to the local governments. So they've been absorbing at their level. That's the fight that takes place there now. So,
thank you.
Professor Rajan, we're at 2:30, but thank you so much for such an interesting session and for your time today. We all got to learn a lot from this and for helping us with an interactive Q&A. Before we wrap up, just one announcement, people. The Adam Smith Society is hosting its annual event from June 7th to 9th. Maria in the chat shared the link to sign up for the event. So please feel free to sign up. We look forward to your participation, and we're excited that it's going to be a really good event. Again, thank you so much, everyone, for joining in today. And thanks again, Professor Rajan, for being here with us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.